Now, with all the main stories making the headlines this Friday night, it's the ITV News at 10.
A sorry state. Downing Street apologises to the Queen for two parties held on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. Just hours before the Queen sat grieving alone, there was drinking and dancing in the basement of number 10. Today it said sorry, but for many who lost loved ones, it can never be enough.
We didn't have a reception after his funeral. We all went back home on our own, and they drank and partied and had a DJ in the basement.
The Prime Minister may not have attended these parties, but for many they are indicative of the culture of his office. And tonight came news of another party held by, wait for it, the former head of the COVID task force. At the end of a torrid week, Anushka will gauge Boris Johnson's prospects of political survival. Also on News at 10 tonight. Is it almost game over for Djokovic down under after his visa's revoked again? Get vaxxed or face a fine. James is in Greece as a Sunday deadline looms for the unjabbed over 60s. Coming in from the cold, the British Army captain who smashed boundaries and crossed Antarctica, home at last.
I just kept falling into these ridges, but I just stayed down for a minute and I just thought this is literally the hardest thing I've ever done.
And the child prodigy who is Rachmaninoff's last pupil releasing an album at 97.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. It was one of the defining images of the pandemic, the Queen sitting alone at her husband's funeral with no one to comfort her, even in one of the hardest moments of her reign and her personal life, leading by example. Contrast that with the scenes at Downing Street the night before, where its emerged staff partied into the early hours, fuelled by a suitcase full of alcohol. Boris Johnson wasn't there, and notably it was number 10, not the Prime Minister, which apologised to Buckingham Palace today. But for many, after a week of damaging revelations about parties in Downing Street, it's all a matter of the culture at the heart of power and the leadership of the man at the top.
It was an iconic image that spoke not only to the Queen's pain, but to the pain of a nation that had suffered loneliness and isolation as a result of the pandemic. But we now know that on the night of the 16th of April, as the Queen prepared for Prince Philip's funeral, some Downing Street staff brought a suitcase of wine into the building for leaving parties that included music and dancing, resulting today in this. It is deeply regrettable that this took place at a time of national mourning, and number 10 has apologised to the palace. An apology to the Queen. So has the time come for Boris Johnson to resign?
No. I mean, these stories are terrible. And I can completely understand the sense of exasperation and anger that people feel. Completely. But we've got an investigation going on now, and rather than this sort of drip of revelations, we need to have a complete, full, candid account of everything that went on.
Drip, drip, drip is right, and with every story comes a little more fury for the public, as so many conversations across the country turn to the same subject.
Boris wants a party! La, 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 la.
And there's anger among Tory MPs like Andrew Bridgen, who's the latest to submit a letter of no confidence in the Prime Minister.
He's lost his moral authority to lead the country. Leadership is about setting an example.
And then there was more. Kate Josephs, who headed up the actual government unit that writes COVID restrictions, apologising for having leaving drinks on December the 17th, 2020. The same day that a government Twitter account said this to a member of the public. Hi Mick, you must not have a work Christmas lunch or party where that is a primarily social activity. It's too much to bear for Fran Hall, whose husband Steve died of COVID in October 2020, just 3 weeks after their wedding. For most of his time in hospital, she couldn't be with him.
While people like me were sitting on their own, while I was at the graveside where Steve was buried and I couldn't have people hug me. We didn't have a reception after his funeral. We all went back home on our own and they drank and partied and had a DJ in the basement.
She and others are painting heart after heart on this wall opposite Parliament in memory of those lost to COVID.
This wall is a wall of love and it's a wall of grief, but it's also a wall of anger.
Anger that will be hard for Boris Johnson to quell. Anushka Astana, News at 10.
Well, as Anushka was saying, there has been an almost constant stream of stories about supposed parties in Westminster while COVID restrictions were in force, with everything from cheese and wine in the sunshine to Christmas drinks in the Cabinet Office. Well, so far we know of more than a dozen events stretching back to the two Downing Street garden parties held in May 2020 at the height of lockdown, to drinks and leaving do's in November that year, and a whole string of parties which took place in the run-up to Christmas. And then, of course, there is the latest revelation of drinks and dancing in Downing Street the night before the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. Well, we can speak now to Anushka, who's in Downing Street tonight, where I think we can safely assume there is not much of a party atmosphere, Anushka. A really torrid week for Boris Johnson's position and the whole culture over which he's presided there in the building behind you. Yeah, a culture which I think it's fair to say is pretty different to most offices. I personally have lost count of the number of parties, and as actually Robert has been talking about for some time, there is also this Friday night drinking culture here. Sources have told me about bottles lined up at the end of the room, and tonight the Daily Mirror has a photograph of a wine fridge actually being wheeled in to keep it all chilled. You know, the idea of Wine Time Friday is apparently not new. People tell me it was happening pre-2015, even with the suitcase. But what is new is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and when it was happening, the rest of us were locked down. Now, MPs will be scattering all over the country, back in their constituencies, talking and listening to people and their commentary on this as we speak tonight, Anushka. A moment of maximum peril when they all come back next week. Oh, Tory MPs are furious, and a number of them have said to me that today's revelations make it much worse. As you say, they're in their constituencies and they tell me they're listening to angry voters and angry members. Senior ministers have said to me they're really reluctant to go out on the media for the Prime Minister because they simply don't know what is coming next. One MP said an 8-year-old boy raised Boris Johnson and parties to him. There will be a really difficult day on Monday for the Prime Minister. Once he's past that, there's going to be a difficult moment when Sue Gray reports for the civil service. If he gets through that, there could be very, very difficult May elections. Many MPs think that ultimately it is over for the Prime Minister. Inside there are reports tonight that he is trying to save himself, perhaps by having other people quit instead. You wouldn't believe the name that apparently they are informally giving it, Operation Save Big Dog. Now, I should tell you, when I went to them about it, they did say that that wasn't a phrase they recognised. OK, Anushka, it's been a long week, hasn't it? Thank you very much indeed for that. Well, to the day's other news now, and at any moment we're expecting to hear that Novak Djokovic has been detained in Australia as the battle over his right to be in the country reaches its climax. Having had his visa revoked for a second time, the unvaccinated tennis star now faces a tiebreaker in court on Sunday. Lose and he'll be on a flight home, win and he'll begin his Australian Open defence the very next day.
Enjoying his final few hours of freedom before heading back into detention. 3 days before he's due to start the defence of his Australian Open title, Novak Djokovic faces a second legal fight to renew his visa.
Breaking tonight, Novak Djokovic's visa cancelled.
A decision just moments ago.
The decision to prolong this saga was made by Immigration Minister Alex Hawke on health and good order grounds, on the basis that it was in the public interest to do so. Prime Minister Scott Morrison backed his judgment. Australians have made many sacrifices during this pandemic, and they rightly expect the result of those sacrifices to be protected. In Serbia, their Prime Minister was quick to defend a national hero. Why do you mistreat him and make fun of him? Not only him, but also his family and an entire nation that is free and proud. Do you need to win some elections, he asked. Do you need to please your public? En route to the final of a tournament he's playing in Sydney, Sir Andy Murray said a final decision must be made quickly.
It just seems like it's dragged on for quite a long time now, and yeah, not great for the tennis, not great for the Australian Open, not great for Novak. But yeah, ultimately people, have to make their own choices. But there is also consequences sometimes for those decisions.
Since his first visa was revoked, Djokovic has admitted being out and about when he knew he was infectious with COVID, and also that he was in 2 different countries in the weeks before arriving in Australia, when his application stated he was not.
The first cancellation was done by a delegate of the minister, so someone that's employed by the Minister for Immigration. And now the second one, that's been done by the minister personally. So it's going to be a lot harder to win in court this time around, I think.
Public protests now seem likely once the tournament gets underway next week. But until the defending champion's fate is decided on Sunday, no one knows which side will be doing the protesting. Steve Scott, News at 10.
Well, while it's one unvaccinated man making headlines in Australia, in Greece the focus is on a much wider group. There, as in the UK, around 70% of the population is fully vaccinated. But the Greek authorities have had enough of the unvaccinated filling intensive care units. And from Sunday, the over 60s face a choice: get jabbed or get fined. Described by some as a tax for the burden they're placing on hospitals, opponents are calling it blackmail.
A last protest by unvaccinated health workers against a government that has suspended them from work and is on the point of making vaccinations mandatory. From Sunday, if you're over 60 and still unjabbed, the fine will be €100 a month, every month. Very soon it's expected to apply to over 50s as well. For all their noise and anger, there's no chance of the policy being reversed, not least because the vaccination centres are full again. Many getting boosters, but 200,000 of the most resistant elderly finally getting their first jab. On the street outside, Rena had given in to pressure, but was angry about it. We're only doing it because they put a knife to our throat, she said. This is blackmail. My main reason for being here is the fine, said Georgios. My pension's only €500 a month. With Greek intensive care beds filled with the unvaccinated, the head of the Greek Medical Association would like to see the policy extended.
It's necessary all the adults to get vaccinated. And of course, if the government decides to do it mandatory, we'll support it.
In the shadow of the statue of Hippocrates, revered as the father of medicine, the Greek medical establishment has united behind the policy. One of those advising the government saying it's not so much compulsion as a way of making vaccine refuseniks pay towards their impact on the health system.
Yeah, it's a tax. This is like the people have to pay for the disproportionate burden that they put on the system. And the other way around is that we have to put social measures, social distancing measures over the whole population. That's even worse.
The opposition's being led by medical refuseniks, all of whom are now suspended from practicing and may soon be sacked altogether. They simply don't believe the figures being produced by their former colleagues. You believe that the Greek doctors, that the Greek medical establishment is lying to the Greek people?
It's difficult to believe it, but I think that this is happening.
If they fine you €100 a month, if you lose your job, would that be enough to make you get vaccinated?
Of course not.
The demonstrators march and protest, most probably in vain, before the end of February. Austria and Italy will also be enforcing mandatory vaccinations. As Omicron rises in Europe, tolerance for the unvaccinated is fading fast. James Mates, News at 10, Athens.
In Wales, the number of COVID cases is declining, with First Minister Mark Drakeford saying that if that continues, most restrictions will be phased out over the next fortnight. By next Friday, there will be no limits on attendance at outdoor events, meaning Six Nations rugby matches can go ahead. And from January the 28th, the rule of six and social distancing will be scrapped in hospitality and nightclubs will reopen. Well, with the Omicron wave has come renewed pressure, of course, on the NHS and in particular bed space in our hospitals. Helping to make room and to get patients home or even preventing them going there in the first place is a major challenge for health workers, a task made all the harder by high staff absences. For the latest in our Fight on the Frontline series, Emily's been to want to see how one trust is trying to solve the problem.
Beneath the skyline in Portsmouth, in communities across the city, little things are making a big difference. Starting her day caring for people at home, Natalie drives to her first patient. She's a community nurse with the rapid response team.
Hello, Valerie, it's the nurse from the rehab team.
Valerie has MS and needs daily care and physio.
And remember, there's no rush. Slow and steady always wins the race.
Last week, Valerie had a fall and needed hospital treatment, only she couldn't get in.
I landed outside QA Hospital with 23 other ambulances and everyone had a patient in, and the doctor treated me in the ambulance.
Natalie's job is to ensure Valerie doesn't have to wait for care again.
A lot of people don't want to be in hospital, so if we can keep them at home with the support, the right support in place, hospital can be avoided.
So his predicted discharge date is the 30th of January.
And that's what her and her colleagues are doing on a daily basis, helping to unblock the bottlenecks in hospitals by getting patients home and caring for them there.
That's it. We haven't got a social worker today. All our social workers have got COVID.
With so many staff absences, though, things have slowed right down and not all patients can be discharged when they want.
If this winter has taught us anything, it is how important the relationship is between local hospitals and social care in the community. The moment that breaks down, like it has in some areas because of COVID, then the whole system freezes up.
And have you noticed an improvement already?
Oh yeah, in the movement.
Natalie's second patient is Pam. She had to spend 59 days in hospital and was desperate to leave.
I couldn't wait to come home. And once I was home, it was wonderful. You know, it made a lot of difference to me. I think it helped me get better quicker to come home. Yeah, definitely.
Staying in hospital was not a good thing?
No. Not for that long.
Getting more people out of hospital like Pam won't happen overnight, but there's no doubt this team are doing everything they can to help. Emily Morgan, News at 10 in Portsmouth.
The woman who has accused Prince Andrew of sexual assault says the decision to allow her civil lawsuit to go ahead will give her the opportunity to expose the truth. Virginia Giuffre claims she was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein to have sex with the Duke when she was 17, allegations he has always strenuously denied. After a US judge ruled the case should go ahead, the Queen stripped her son of his military titles and royal patronages, and today there were calls for him to lose his dukedom too. Now, of all the horrors which have occurred since the Syrian civil war broke out more than a decade ago, some of the worst we know of were committed at a prison in Damascus known as Hell on Earth. Yesterday, there was a rare moment of justice. A senior official in President Assad's regime, who oversaw the torture of more than 4,000 inmates there, was convicted in Germany of crimes against humanity. His detention only came about after a chance encounter with one of his former prisoners, who told us today he didn't want revenge, only justice for the countless Syrians who have suffered.
After a decade, Syria's conflict appears now to be a war Western powers no longer remember or care about. But those caught up in it will never forget or forgive those who perpetrated the worst crimes imaginable against their own people. Not just the attacks on entire cities of civilians, but the torture and killing of thousands of opponents of President Assad, whose grim fate was documented in hundreds of photos smuggled out of Damascus. This week, one of those responsible for torturing some 4,000 inmates in the notorious Al-Khatib prison finally faced justice. But Colonel Anwar Raslan was only here because he was spotted at a refugee camp in Germany by chance by one of his former prisoners. Anwar al-Bunni was here to see his former tormentor sentenced for crimes against humanity. A twist of fate and a chance encounter meant the jailer has finally become an inmate, tonight starting a life sentence in Germany.
The moment that you saw the colonel in Germany, tell me what happened.
I didn't recognize him that times. I know this guy, but I didn't remember his name. Second time I saw him in the near the camp. Third time I saw him shopping in Berlin. I will not forgive, but I don't need revenge. I need justice, for not just for me. I need justice for all the victims in Syria.
Maimouna Al-Ammar was also detained by Syria's security police while she was pregnant. Her videos of their bombed-out home and office explain why they had no choice but to flee and rebuild their life in Coventry. Her thoughts are never far from those left behind in Syria's prisons.
A lot of my relatives were arrested and tortured just for demanding freedom and dignity, including my father and mother. My only two brothers have been in detention for over 9 years now.
What does this verdict mean for you?
We consider it as a victory for tens of thousands of Syrian survivors of torture.
In a war which levelled cities, left perhaps 500,000 dead, it's easy to overlook those who disappeared into the regime's secret prisons. But this week's verdict is a first tentative step in holding to account those who tortured, raped and killed in the name of President Assad. Dan Rivers, News at 10.
Here, ever since Azim Rafiq came forward with his experiences of racism in cricket, one question has been what can be done about a problem which MPs today described as being endemic. In a new report, their recommendation is to hit the England and Wales Cricket Board in its pockets, withholding public funds unless it cleans up its act.
A sport where racism is deep-seated that needs to clean up its act. Those the words of a committee of MPs investigating the treatment of former Yorkshire County Cricket Club player Azim Rafiq, whose allegations of institutional racism prompted a major inquiry.
It's endemic throughout the game, and a lot of the counties, I feel like, are still in the defensive mentality and pretending that this is just a Yorkshire problem.
Since speaking out, he says his family have received threats of physical violence.
There was a lot of people who were prepared to come out publicly, and the system wanted to scare them, and they managed to do that because it has deterred a lot of people from coming forward.
This is where it all began, when an internal investigation found that Azim Rafiq had been subjected to racial harassment and bullying, but concluded that no one would face disciplinary action as a result. The backlash against that decision has since prompted a whole raft of resignations and dismissals, and a lot of soul-searching on a much wider scale.
Today's report says there are grounds for optimism here, with Yorkshire County Cricket Club adding that it wants to become a beacon for action and change. But if similar progress isn't made elsewhere, the report authors say the England and Wales Cricket Board should be starved of the £2.5 million of government funding it receives each year.
The ECB and the English game is currently in the emergency room, and the only way it gets out of the emergency room is by taking tough action.
The ECB say they embrace the ongoing scrutiny of the committee and are determined to root out racism and other forms of discrimination from their sport. The England women's captain also added her support.
All the stuff that's gone on, it's obviously been pretty uncomfortable and unpleasant, but I think it's something that hopefully will lead to something good.
With many hoping today's report will be a watershed moment after the racism that remained hidden for years. Hannah Miller, News at 10, Leeds.
Now, if you were watching News at 10 last week, you may have seen the story of Prodigy's adventure across Antarctica. The British Army captain became the first woman of South Asian heritage to trek solo to the South Pole. Well, today she was back on more hospitable terrain after flying home. So what's she going to do after taking on some of the most extreme conditions on the planet? We'll give her feet a hard-earned rest, she tells us, and put them up in front of the telly.
She has just trekked 700 miles across Antarctica in icy isolation. But it's this that melts her. Prodigy last saw her fiancé David 2 months ago when he proposed, but she barely had chance to show off her ring, travelling instead to one of the most extreme places on the planet. But she is now back on home soil.
It all still feels a little bit surreal, to be honest. People keep asking me if it's sunk in yet, and the fact that I've done the expedition has, because, you know, I spent 2 years training for it. I think it might take me a little while to catch up with the reactions.
Her training took her to Greenland to experience hostile weather, and she pulled tyres for hours to prepare for dragging a 195-pound sled. During this immense challenge, she spent 42 days battling 60-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures of minus 45 degrees.
The wind at that stage was just relentless. It was like just so much headwind. It was like super cold, and I just kept falling into these like ridges. But I just stayed down for a minute, and I just thought, this is literally the hardest thing I've ever done.
For now, all she is interested in is enjoying life's creature comforts.
A few things: going home and sitting in a blanket and binge watching some series on TV with my partner, and then going to go to my mum's house, my brother's, meet my new nephew as well.
And she certainly deserves some time to put her feet up. Amy Lewis, News at 10.
And finally, it was in the late 1920s the world was first introduced to the incredible talents of pianist Ruth Slenjinska. When she made her concert debut aged just 4, she went on to perform across the globe, counting presidents and the Empress of Japan among the audiences she's enchanted. The last surviving pupil of the great Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. Tomorrow is her 97th birthday, and she has good reason to celebrate. She's just landed a new record deal.
Ruth Slenjinska has been playing the piano for very nearly 100 years. For her new album, she delivers Bach's music with the same graceful precision she has always done. She just doesn't play as much of it as she used to.
When one gets to be my age, you cannot play everything. They are simply more than a lady my age can do. But I can do still quite a bit.
Ruth was a child prodigy in 1920s America.
And what are you going to play for the audience?
I'm going to play a minuet in G major by Beethoven.
That's fine.
The ability she displayed once she'd climbed onto the piano stool was extraordinary. But don't call it the result of some natural gift.
It did not come naturally.
Right.
It came with lots and lots and lots of hard work, between 8 and 9 hours a day of practice.
As a concert pianist, Ruth went around the world, a star who sold out concert halls, summoned more than once to the White House.
I'm going to play a duet with President Truman. And it went very well, and he's a pretty good pianist. It was smooth, it was musical. I was as thrilled as could be.
Behind the virtuoso, as she practices now at her home in Pennsylvania, there's a photograph of her inspiration, the great Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff.
He was unlike any piano teacher that I had had before. He had a different way of thinking about music. With him, music was a story.
It strikes me as a very male-dominated world. Did you ever find it tough as a woman making your way through that world and making sure that your talent was always showcased in the best way it could be?
It doesn't sound pretty. Are you sure you want me to tell you?
I do, yeah.
You have to play twice as well as the male pianist to get paid half what he gets as a fee.
And has that situation got better in recent years or not? No.
You have to love your audience. I try to give them the most beautiful music I can.
The extraordinary skills of Ruth Selenjinska. That is it for tonight. Have a great weekend. Good night.